And Joe is going to tell us about threat detection construction and also the evolution of Lego. I know a lot of people are really excited for this talk. So thank you for being here, Joe. We're really, really grateful that you're here to share your knowledge and your hobby of Legos with us today. Um, uh-oh, Joe, you're not coming through on sound.
Hold on.
Here we go. That sounds better.
Yes, there we go.
All right,
All
awesome.
right, and let's get slides up as well, shall we? Okay, looks like we're good to go.
Looks good.
All right, well, hey, thank you so much for the introduction, Leslie. It's a pleasure to be a part of this event. I mean, it's a star-studded cast between yourself, having Elle kick things off this morning, and then a number of really awesome talks throughout the day. So really privileged to be here, but enough of that because everyone knows how awesome this is and how privileged it is to be here. Let's talk about threat detection and the evolution of Lego. So first, so hello, who am I? So my name is Joe Slowik. Currently, my day job is leading threat intelligence and detections engineering at Gigamon, so focused on the network side of things. I also do cyber threat intelligence and threat modeling training through a company I founded called Paralysis. So that's kind of the banner under which I'm doing this since it is a weekend. Previously, Leslie and I actually had the opportunity to work together when I was at Dragos. They still are. I am obviously have moved on, but I've also done cyber threat intelligence in a variety of other ecosystems ranging to domain tools, as well as doing work in the incident response realm at Los Alamos National Laboratory and various things in the US military once upon a time. But enough about me. The main reason we're here today is to talk about detections as well as to talk about Lego. So what does that mean? Well, first, our agenda for today, we'll talk about what detections actually are, what they mean, and then get into a bit of detection construction and contextuality that'll build up into a theory of threat detection. And then we're going to take a sharp left turn and go into something that I adore, and in fact, you may pick out a couple of items behind me, in terms of Lego. We'll talk about the evolution of Lego as a system, as a construct, as a toy, if you wanted to be dismissive, I suppose, of what that looks like going from really not just the 80s, but back to the early 20th century almost, but use that as a pivot point to talk about how we can start achieving complexity through better engineering and better understanding of just what it is that we're dealing with and the component pieces of what it is that we are working with at any given point in time. So first, detection. I often like including definitions when I start talking about things because it helps level set a common understanding of what it is we're discussing. So saying something like, oh, detections, I know what that is. Like, well, do you really? So we can look at detections as being some way of developing and implementing appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. That boring definition is brought to you courtesy of NIST. It works well enough, but at least conceptualizes this idea that we're looking for some identifiable item that leads to a warning or a other alert that draws our attention to a given matter, typically with a security focus to it. Now, the problem is that there's detection or there's training around information security, around red teaming, around forensics, around cyber threat intelligence, around industrial control systems. If you start looking for something that's focused on threat detection and detection development, there's really not a whole lot out there. There's certainly training towards different tools that could be used for threat detection, like if you want to write Zeek modules, or you want to write Suricata rules, or you want to develop Yara or other items, but very little into discussion of just how does this work out in practice and what is an all-encompassing theory of threat detection that we can apply to our organizations. Of course, I say this, and SANS 525 or whatever will come out or next week or something on detection development or something. But for now, we have a market gap, so to speak, and that's a pretty important one because when we think about what drives a lot of our security programs, it's the SOC or incident responders responding to a detection that fires in the environment. And so in practice, what we typically have, and I think this is one of the problems that we have in terms of detection training, is things are typically very vendor or very product focused. So you have a Splunk, you have a QRadar, you have an ArcSight, I'm sorry, you have an EDR product or an NDR product or whatever, and you're operating within the confines of that given solution, and then trying to identify different ways of setting up queries for identifying things of interest or things that are suspicious. And that's all well and good, but the thing is we have to ask ourselves just how useful, how accurate, and how sustainable that methodology might be. Because if we start looking at detections and operations from a very typical perspective, we usually operate from the perspective of flagging something bad. Like if view this IP address, then we wait for it to appear, like, oh, I have network traffic to this atomic indicator or some other item, and then we do something about it. The problem is that a lot of these steps are, if not ill-defined, well, ill-defined would be kind of beneficial. Typically, they're not defined at all. That we develop or practitioners develop some saved search criteria or saved alerting criteria around a situation of interest, but then there's no real background information for why that situation is interesting, let alone harmful. And in passively waiting for it to appear, we cede a lot of initiative to our adversaries to take part in other operations before that single item of interest pops up. And then as far as doing something, we're typically, from a detection development perspective, just throwing things over the fence from detections development to security operations, saying, hey, something bad happened, go figure it out. And that all seems a little suboptimal. Because if we start looking at how this functions in practice, the typical detection workflow leaves an awful lot to be desired. So if we look at this from, again, that perspective of identifying activity of interest, creating some saved or persistent query that's looking for that activity, typically in the form of an atomic indicator like an IP address, a hash value, a domain name, maybe a registry key or something else, and then providing a notification when that activity is observed, typically with some time lag involved as well, we start seeing a number of problems emerge in that sort of problem or construct. For one, when we're identifying activity of interest, we're really looking at something that is fundamentally backward focused. So if I'm focusing on a given IP, or for example, something that I'm sure the CTI Twitter mafia has been squealing about the last 24 hours or so is, oh my goodness, there was a wiper attack in Ukraine or whatever. What do we do about this? Well, one of the calls is like, oh, we need hash values or other items or whatever to look for this. That's cool, but as we start looking at atomic indicators and other items, is that we're typically chasing the last breach as opposed to focusing on the fundamentals of how adversaries operated to try to capture future activity. We could talk about indicators for an hour beyond this, and I don't want to make this a discussion focused on that, but as a starting point, it really sets us up for a non-ideal way of responding to threats. But then as we start getting further along this process and creating a saved query looking for these sorts of observables, we get into the problem that behaviors can be modified, changed, or specifically developed in order to evade detections. So for the log4j scenario that everyone had to deal with as we got changed from 2021 to 2022, there was a new proof of concept or a new implementation of the log4j exploitation string popping up on Twitter at least every couple of hours from some red teamer or OffSec researcher. If you were trying to chase down every single implementation of fuzzing the log4j exploitation string, leaving aside that you could just encrypt it in TLS or whatever, and you're not going to see it to begin with, you're fighting a losing battle, as there's simply too many ways for the adversary to try to circumvent those sorts of detections in order to try to gain desirable levels of execution or ways of implementing that particular activity. And then finally, even if we succeed in all these items that we've identified a piece of infrastructure or a static behavioral pattern and alerting on it for the given adversary, as we get into the notification part of things, like, oh, I have a Splunk alert that fired, like here's an email that contains the query string and the results from it. Like, okay, if I'm a SOC analyst, what do I do? If I'm a tier 1 responder, what are my next steps? If I'm a tier 2 or tier 3 responder getting up into the incident response process, what are the artifacts that I need to prioritize? What is the context around a given element that I need to use in order to really respond to things? And so we take this assumption that, oh, detections, that's just kind of where security just kind of falls together between disciplines of SOC investigations, incident response, forensics, cyber threat intelligence, but we don't spend enough time thinking about, well, how do we actually make this workflow into something that is both valuable as well as sustainable from a defense and defensive operations perspective? So as we start taking a step back from the state of what currently is, at least for most organizations, to where we would like to be, what we want from a detection perspective are items that are flexible enough in order to keep pace with our adversaries. So we don't want something that is looking at last week's breach, but rather looking at a fundamental way of adversary operations that we can continue tracking and responding to moving forward. We want to make sure that whatever it is we're developing is firm enough to avoid noise. We'll get into the nuance on this in just a minute here, so that we don't overburden our responders with lots of ephemeral or plain useless sort of items that they have to chase down. But as part of that process, we also want things to be contextual enough in some fashion that it can inform how we disposition these items when they come across. So that Timmy sitting in his SOC position or whatever is not left in the position where he or she or they are completely blind as far as what their next steps are, but rather they have some idea of like, oh, this falls in this part of the kill chain, or this relates to this sort of adversary or this sort of set of adversary behaviors. Therefore, I should prioritize these data sources, or I should expedite research and evidence retrieval from these ephemeral sources in order to successfully prosecute a given investigation. So diving into these in specific, what is it exactly that we're talking about here? Well, first off, and this is a bias on my end because I am a sort of a cyber threat intelligence practitioner, I guess. I make fun of it all the time on Twitter, so I'm sorry if you've been offended by that, but we have to be a little humble, I think, in our discipline. But having said that, having an understanding of adversary behaviors and adversary operations is pretty vital in developing a sustainable detections process, because in tracking adversary operations, it's not just about performing some like Pokemon collection, gather all the IOCs endeavor, but rather trying to understand fundamental adversary behaviors. So if I'm looking at something like Log4j, what is it that adversaries are actually using or leveraging this exploit for? Dropping crypto miners, installing web shells, going after vCenter instances, understanding the context around how the given technique is used, and then trying to then build detections to reflect how adversaries are evolving and what adversaries are trying to achieve as part of that operation. So looking at this from an intelligence perspective, like, yes, you can yeet out IPs and domains and hash values all day long, that's fine. But if we're trying to add actual value in building a sustainable detection development practice, what we want to do is try to identify what are those persistent items related to adversary operations that we could look for observables on, and then incorporate that into our security tooling and our existing visibility in order to catch those items. That's all well and good, but we have a problem that we have to address as part of this process. Namely, the issue of false positives, but also false negatives, which rarely gets talked about because that's a really troubling subject when you start thinking about it in detail. So false positives, we always talk about in the context of security operations that, oh, false positives suck, they burn out the SOC, we don't want to do these sorts of things, because we're alerting on benign or non-malicious activity and spending resources and running these sorts of things down. And that results in frustration. The SOC doesn't like you. They spit in your coffee. They get burned out. We don't want to live in that area. And so there's always this conception that we want to minimize false positives as part of the detection development process. But it's important to note that this is a double-edged sword, that certainly false positives are one thing that we want to avoid, but in doing so, we have to be mindful of what it is that we're missing. Because a false negative, type 1, type 2 errors, if you want to be very statistical about this, is that we get into false negatives as the dog that didn't bark, missing activity that actually took place. And that results in an intrusion that we didn't catch. And that's really bad. That's where, well, maybe we don't lose our jobs, but maybe the CISO does as a result of something that takes place. So trying to figure out a way of balancing these two perspectives and trying to make sure that we're avoiding false negatives, because we don't want bad stuff to take place that we completely miss. But at the same time, we also don't want to overburden limited security resources to such an extent by having things so broad or so all-encompassing that it's simply impossible to keep up with it. So from a detection development perspective, we need to try to figure out what the sweet spot is for our organization. We'll get to that in just a second. Because before we get to that, I'd also like to talk about this contextuality problem. That we talk about threat detections, threat engineering, that, oh, we just don't want to throw over a detection over the fence and then say, be done with it. Instead, we want to try to provide some degree of context, some background as to why something took place, why it might be important, and what is involved around a given item. That means if we have a security alert, we don't just provide, here's the alert string and here is the event data, fetch, but rather we give the analyst something to cling on to, something to initiate their process of dispositioning and clearing the given event in question, whether that's your tier 1 SOC operator or your really expensive IR retainer that comes in after something really bad happens. Now, one way of approaching this is through playbooks. That is a very popular item in industry right now, in that we can start prescribing specific steps and procedures around a detection. So say detection fires within a management console or within the product space or whatever. It's like, oh, and here's a ticket that links, or a link that translates over into the wiki of, here are the concrete steps that you need to take in order to correctly clear this alert. That's cool, but we have to be mindful of the very real possibility that in establishing playbooks, we can be too rigid. That a playbook, if it is followed from true beginning to end, and end is viewed as being successful or complete on its own, that we may have missed something. So certainly providing some degree of guidance is quite valuable, but making sure that we're not setting things up as being too rigid or without the flexibility for analysts to explore things that are beyond what we anticipated is pretty desirable. So I always look at having something not so much as a playbook, but rather as guidance. That if something comes up as part of a detection firing within our environment, that a detection engineer should put themselves in the position of the responding analyst and try to think about, well, what are the steps that I need to take in order to appropriately enrich and begin investigating this item, and for one, to try to include those within the development of the detection as much as possible, which could lead to some expensive queries and pipes and whatnot, depending upon what sort of system that you're working with, or if you're working in a more robust data solution, trying to nest queries in such a way in order to build a more composite or compound alerting. But really just trying to identify what are the minimum necessary steps in order to start addressing the issue, but not the steps that are simply required in order to close it out. It's a really tough sort of position to be in, because we want to lead our personnel towards success, while at the same time not stifling potential creativity or response to events that would allow us to try to identify instances where things go a bit off of the identified roadmap or expected adversary activity. So that leads us into a continuum of operations, that a lot of the things that I've talked about so far, and this is a very high level discussion of threat detection development, really meant to try and give everyone a background into just what sort of things we need to be keeping in mind as part of this process in securing an organization, that we get into this balance, trying to bring balance to the force between eliminating false positives by only alerting on known bad items and keeping matters very rigid and very predictable in terms of our response and subsequent procedures, or eliminating false negatives by alerting on all suspicious behavior and pretty much giving our analysts completely free rein to take their investigations wherever they may lead. There's something to be said for either of these two poles of this continuum, but for most organizations, well, really for all organizations, we're going to fall somewhere in between, because resources are finite, visibility is limited. We can't simply go down the rabbit hole for every suspicious network traffic activity item that comes across the wire. So from a detection development perspective, we need to have an understanding of both what our resources are, what capabilities we have available to us from both a visibility as well as an investigative standpoint, as well as the risk profile of the organization in question, in order to figure out what is the tolerance level for a false negative or something that we don't catch, given the potential cost in false positives and what that means for the use of resources in our environment. So if we start applying this to a theory of threat detection, we start getting some idea of what it is that we want to try to strive for from a defensive standpoint. We want something that's threat informed, that we understand what adversaries are doing, and we're shaping how it is we respond to events in such a fashion that it is aligned with what is going on out in the wild. And in doing so, focusing on what are the actual behaviors adversaries are using, as opposed to playing whack-a-mole on various hashes related to a compiled version of Mimikatz or something similarly useless. That means that we're being not too specific in what it is that we're looking for and building some degree of flexibility into matters, as well as making sure that notifications as they're provided contain some degree of context, and then getting into the balancing act between our false positive toleration and false negative desire, or what it is we can take as an organization before something truly bad happens and we begin putting the defended organization at risk. So really, it's by taking all of these concepts, ranging from cyber threat intelligence to understand adversary activity, to a very operationally centric view of security at a given organization, to understand visibility, resources, capabilities, and how to then define what it is around a given item that we observe in our environment that allows us to then pursue or flag something for further review by a human in the loop as part of this entire process. So if we're looking for ideals, we want an understanding of tradecraft to yield observables, the initial feedstock into the entire security alerting process. But that understanding of observables is going to yield detection logic, that I'm not just chasing the citing of a specific IP, maybe not even the citing of an ASN or something more general, but rather looking at a series of technical observations that align with an adversary behavior. We'll look at an example towards the end today, so if you're wondering, like, what does this look like? Trust me, we will get there. But as part of all of this, an understanding of why something is important, what it means, how it aligns with adversary activity, should enable some guidance, some direction to the response process, so that whoever is responding after hours or sitting third shift in the SOC or whatever isn't completely left to their own devices when something bad happens, but has something they can lean on, can take advantage of the knowledge already gained through the process of developing and deploying a detection, in order to then prosecute and evaluate that item to make sure that the organization can retain some, or restore its security posture. So that's all really cool and stuff, right? Now we will talk about something completely different, and I think this has come up a couple of times in this conference. So I'm not being very unique or funny here, but at least I have the GIF, right? Anyway, Lego. So I'm a loser. I don't have very many hobbies. I read lots of books. Otherwise, I do security stuff a lot, but one thing I do carve out time for are building Lego. I've been doing this for, I'm not going to say how long because I don't want to tell you how old I am, but Lego is something that I have been doing for quite a long time, and it brings a lot of enjoyment, whether that's following the kit instructions or just sort of freelancing and having fun with what is possible with the pieces in front of me. And so you can see this through a variety of examples, whether it's my significant collection of Star Wars Lego, items like the bonsai tree, which was a lot of fun to build, but also you'll see a picture that Leslie may be familiar with from the Dragos office of the Lego test range that we had there, which was something that was very near and dear to my heart while I was working there. Not pictured here, like I bought the Lego AT-AT, the Ultimate Collector Series set just a few weeks ago. I spend an inordinate amount of money on these sorts of things, but it brings enjoyment and it's cool. But as part of this entire obsession, it's helpful to have an understanding of where Lego came from and what it really means. And so if we look at Lego and its origins, it all started with, well, a duck, which is kind of hilarious on a number of ways. It's neither fuzzy nor snuggly, but it is a duck. And in looking at the history of Lego, Lego was an idea formed by craftsmen in Denmark to really go play. Legot, if you were speaking in Danish and whatnot. So there's a number of cool things around how the company is developed over time in terms of trying to articulate a what we would now call STEM focused way of education and learning, as well as play, and beginning with wooden toys and then getting into the bricks that we all know and love today. So in looking at the bricks, though, we can start seeing something stand out about these items. So if we look at Lego back in the original sort of sense around when the toy developed, we had very blocky sort of designs, things that were built in a very additive fashion without very much use of space or the ability to really get very complex around how designs were put together because things were built by stacking bricks on top of one another. If you go to the Lego Museum in Billund, which I had the opportunity to go to just late last year, which was really cool, you'll see that it was a big deal when Lego introduced the wheel as part of their sets. So it's very much a block-oriented construction design until you get to the last 20 years or so, where Lego as we view it today now becomes less of a exercise in just stacking one brick on top of another, but instead one of building out skeletons of designs and then hanging external pieces off of them to make really complex structures. For example, the Lego Ultimate Collector Series Star Destroyer, which I bought and built, and it took a couple of weeks in order to put that together. You can see it on the floor and where I live or whatever in one phase of construction. But the result that you get is a really complex object at the end that would be damn near impossible to try and construct if you were doing this through a very typical additive block on block structure. Instead, what we're doing is building a skeletal framework, understanding how that framework can support different elements and then hanging different elements on it in order to build a more complex design. So what the hell does that mean? Well, this gets us into a concept, and maybe this is getting a little off track here, but I think it's important, of transitions in engineering, where we could look at something like the pyramids, which certainly are very complex and are a marvel of human ingenuity and creativity, but still, we're talking about lumping really big blocks one on top of one another. And that's pretty much how structures were built for a long time. You could throw columns of different sorts and whatnot in there, but it wasn't really until we got to the 19th century where we started seeing the emergence of the skyscraper. So looking at the development of the Chicago skyline, for example, of seeing the use of materials like steel and other items in order to develop lighter structures that were capable of going higher and allowing for the increased availability of space in terms of design. And we see that as we stretch from something like a 19th century building on State Street in Chicago and getting into some of the fantastic buildings that we can see today, where we have central cores or pillars around which we hang things like glass walls or glass curtains serving as the structure of a skyscraper. Okay, that's really cool, Joe. You know a little bit of architecture or just enough to be dangerous and BS us for a little bit. What's this have to do with Lego or anything else? Well, what it means is that from a results perspective, you can start getting very complex, very interesting designs, such as these items. Actually, this is from the Lego house, also in Billund, which I was able to visit in November this past year. And things like the Lego dinosaurs or the tree of knowledge or tree of creativity, rather, that's sitting at the center of the staircase at the Lego house structure. You can't build those just by doing brick on brick on brick, but rather need to start articulating what is the fundamental structure and the baseline around which I am trying to reach my end goal of some form, some design, whether that be a very interesting looking dinosaur, a massive tree with different villages and whatnot on each branch, or even getting into things like a Star Destroyer or the Death Star, if you're into Star Wars Lego like I am. And it's understanding how these things come together through both pre-planning and understanding the underpinnings behind these things that we can start getting to a point where not just complex, but also more interesting and more complete designs become possible. That's why when you see things like the really interesting Lego constructions from TV shows or in YouTube videos or whatnot, is that you really do have this idea of a skeletal-like structure behind how these things are put together in order to make sure that you're not, for one, not building something that is completely untenable because of the number of pieces required, but also that allows for the efficient use of space, material, and reflection and design to come up with something at the end that is very visually pleasing, like the three dinosaurs at the Lego house. So what did we learn here? Well, we learned that firm foundations and a sound base are pretty much necessary if you want to start building a structure. So if we look back at the Lego Star Destroyer model that I flashed up a little bit ago, we're talking about a central spine with a couple of spokes off of it around which other pieces will hang. And that gets us to those intermediate structures that enable us to then start trying to create a more complex design around that centralized core that then yield things like the two shield generator towels, the little bubbles or balls or whatever on top of the bridge section of the Star Destroyer, or looking at things like a daily beacon building if you're into the Marvel series of Legos, where it's not a solid structure, but rather it has rooms and such. And so it can be very both light in structure as well as useful, transportable, playable in form, and allowing us to express more complex ideas than what we would get just by doing a fairly blocky brick on brick, no sort of space in between structure. So, okay, that's cool. I did my 2 parts already, but the thing is that wait, there's more. Because this relates to InfoSec and it relates to detection development. Because if we can start constructing a base understanding of how it is that adversaries operate, what adversaries need to do in order to get credential reuse and gather credentials, to achieve lateral movement, to gain PrivSec, privilege escalation within an environment. Well, understanding those fundamental adversary needs and desires and then translating those behaviors into the visible observables related to them, tracking, trying to dump LSAS memory, or trying to brute force credentials within an environment, and how that's manifest within logs or different security products, that gives us the capability and the opportunity to start building detection logic around those observables with the contextuality of why that sort of activity matters. So it's not just, hey, bad IP, go look at this, but rather, hey, we identified credential stuffing activity from this address, which is located in a VPS server farm somewhere or whatever. You might want to look at this as a possible initial access vector into our environment. Very simplistic example, but at least starting to get into the multifaceted approach that we need to take from detection development in order to come up with items that are high confidence, reduce the incidence of false positives, and allows the responding analyst to have some context around why it matters or what it is they need to do about these sorts of activities. So in looking at that, we can take this mindset that we see in the development of Lego over the last 20, 30 years, looking at things like the Star Wars Ultimate Collector series, the various Technic sets, which are very complex and very interesting. If you've never put one together, they are pretty cool in order to mess around with, among other structures, and taking this way of understanding how pieces fundamentally fit together in order to then translate that into a way of building threat detections within the products and the visibility that we have at our disposal from a security perspective. So if we're looking at this and building out a detection, I mean, what does this look like in practice? Well, instead of doing something like I want to alert on here's evil hash whatever for some kill disk variant or pick a malware family that you like. Well, I don't want to alert on a hash because, as we know from Dave Bianco and others, hashes are trivially easy to modify. So instead, I want to try and identify some way of identifying the malicious or suspicious use of software within my environment. So maybe I start with a hypothesis like, you know what, files that execute from app data user local temp or user app data local temp, that's usually not good. I mean, yes, Chrome installs from there and some other things, which goes into what you're allowing or denying in your environment. But file execution from temp directory, like, okay, that seems like something that could relate to at minimum unauthorized, if not outright malicious activity. But if we built this out as a detection on its own, provided we even had the visibility in the first place, that sucks. It's something, it gives us insight into certain activities that could be used for malicious purposes, But yeah, and comment in chat about like WebEx and meeting apps that drop a little installer or whatever that you have to run every time. You're going to be drowning in noise around these sorts of items. So we need to start building out a framework from this central point of execution in permissible environments on the operating system to figure out like, okay, well, let's say I can contextualize where that binary came from, and it's coming from an unknown or untrusted location. So instead of coming from WebEx or Microsoft or Google or whatnot, it's coming from, and this is no offense to any of these providers, because in fact, a lot of these providers work very diligently to try to clean up their environment, but it's a download from DigitalOcean or Linode or some other OVH, take your pick or whatever. It's like, oh, I have a binary file that's coming from a less than trustworthy area of the internet that's not necessarily associated with enterprise permissible products, and then it's dropping to temp location and executing. Well, now I'm starting to construct a building or a framework around that initial observation, like, hey, things that execute out of temp are kind of weird. Well, they're really weird if they start coming from locations that we don't trust or that we can't assess some degree of reliability around where they originate. But even that could be fuzzy because you see plenty of plenty of software companies that rent out VPS instances or use some AWS instance in order to host updates and whatnot. So like, oh, this still might be a little noisy, but I can start expanding on this even further to look at sort of right of execution activity to say like, you know what, when I start seeing these three items correlated with one another, binary downloaded from some untrusted location, execution within the user's temp directory, and then followed temporally by either directly related to the process executing, if I can have visibility for that, or temporally I identify network traffic shortly after that execution to a similarly unknown or untrusted network resource. Well, now I'm cooking with something that has some legs to it and that can identify a sequence of individual observables that tie together into an overall structure of a security alert that provides some context for my responding analyst if they see that, like, oh, it looks like I'm identifying a downloader here. I should see, like, did it execute? What came down from that follow-on communication? And similar sorts of steps. But also establishing enough sort of visibility around items so that I can significantly reduce my false positive my number of false positive incidents, while also ensuring that I'm capturing activity of interest that are part of an adversary's infection chain. And again, this is a really simplistic example. There are carve-outs and exceptions to this entire process, depending upon your environment, who your vendors are, and what sort of other systems that you're using. But this is what we need to start doing if we're thinking about threat detection or security detection, development, and detection engineering. Not looking at them as like, oh, if IP observed, then alert, but rather assembling these items from different observables just as we would build with Lego bricks in order to come up with more complex and more interesting structures that fit into a more robust security posture. So that is it for the prepared content. I was tracking a couple of questions that popped up in the Slack, so I will review those momentarily. You could look at the Republic gunship, which I put together over the Christmas holidays while you're staring at that. But also, you could follow me on Twitter. If you do that, I make no apology. Buyer beware there, but also feel free to contact me. A lot of the stuff that I talked about are things that I teach as part of my threat intelligence offering with Paralysis. So if that's interesting, reach out to me. I also blog very frequently on my own at pylos.co. But in looking at the chat, let me try to find.
Hey, Joe, I got them all together.
Oh, sweet. Okay.
Great presentation, by the way. This is a lot of fun. All right. So let's see. First, in regards to the first part of the presentation, would MITRE ATT&CK help?
MITRE ATT&CK definitely helps because it starts identifying gaps and holes in the overall detection framework. So the point of this presentation was more upon focused on developing specific detections around specific activities. If we start expanding that approach to a more macro level of thinking like, well, what detections do I need in my environment? Well, that's where ATT&CK steps into play, where I can do an assessment based upon visibility and existing detection coverage of like, well, what attack techniques am I covering right now, and what attack techniques am I missing, or do I have less than ideal coverage, in order to then prioritize the development of subsequent items. So you've got to start somewhere, and I would advocate for this very building block approach to detection development. But once that starts kicking off in a meaningful fashion, and you start developing an overall security program, having a framework like MITRE ATT&CK, or at a more abstracted level, even something like just kill chain analysis, can be very valuable in trying to identify what are areas of priority for resource investment and for analyst research and development in order to sort of fill those gaps and plug those holes.
Great, thank you. Next question, is there an open source threat detection playbook or some guidance out there? I know some folks already shared some, but I guess if you have any off the top of your head, you can post them in Track One chat whenever you get a chance, or if you want to tell them what it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that I noticed coming across in Slack, which would be the same things I would recognize, like things like Caldera, attack emulation frameworks. There's some vendors that do that as well. But again, MITRE has some frameworks that align with this pretty nicely that could be used in order to make this happen. This is an area of ongoing research for myself, so maybe I'll have something later this year. We'll see, at least at a sort of philosophical level, for how to approach this subject. But yeah, I mean, there are a number of resources. It's really about trying to figure out both what appetite the organization has, as well as the resources to follow up for whatever good ideas come across in order to then execute on.
Excellent. Next was, could you talk more about what context means for you? This person was on a detection development side and now is in IR. They can't analyze the incident if they don't know what they're catching and what you're missing with the established detection. So sometimes that needs to be very detailed.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of all of that. One of the points that I started off with is that detection development seems like it's just an assumed competency when it comes to security, that outside of building tool-specific items, there's very little in terms of education or theory behind how it is these items get constructed and why they should be constructed in certain ways. So first identifying that gap, and then trying to figure out, well, based upon the disciplines that we do have insight into, whether that's incident response, SOC operations, cyber threat intelligence, network and host forensics, how do we combine viewpoints from those in order to start building a detection lifecycle or concrete detection items that we know that we'll need, or that will address some of the questions that we'll have when these items come across. So I guess the thesis that was unstated as part of this, and which if I were to revise this and give it again, I would include at the forefront, is looking at detection as being the center point or the nexus around which other security operations disciplines revolve around, both for building out what those detections should be, as well as responding to them after the fact. And ignoring that discipline is really to our detriment, because this is really the driving factor beyond third-party external notification that, hey, you have a breach, of how we figure out that something bad is going on. And that we've underinvested, in my opinion, in this discipline is pretty tragic. And we need to start fixing that.
Okay, now over to the Lego questions. So I know you showed quite a few images, and I don't know which specific one this is for, but how long does a Lego structure like that take to build? I'm assuming it was like the massive dinosaur ones, the trees. I'm sure everyone is different. How do you, as a Lego aficionado, do you kind of have a good idea of like how long something's going to take before you even start?
I can guesstimate by the number of bags that are in a given set. So one thing for those who have been doing Lego for a while may appreciate, back in the day, back when I was a kid and we were walking uphill both ways in the snow and whatnot backwards, Lego sets were pretty hard to build. The instructions were like, okay, here's a list of all the steps. There's no words whatsoever, and everything comes in the same box. Now, things are broken up in such a fashion where you have instructions broken down by bag numbers, so you can follow things through fairly well and not have to do things like hunt for pieces and whatnot, which makes things exceptionally easy. I would argue not as fun for the kids these days, but still probably makes the process significantly more efficient. Well, as a result of that, if I can get an idea for how many bags a set has, like, oh, that gives me a ballpark idea, like 30 to 45 minutes a bag as a very conservative sort of estimate sounds about right. Depending upon what it is that you're building, that may either go up or could go way down. So for example, the Star Destroyer, the Ultimate Collector Series one, which is about 3 feet long, that took me, I mean, I did it over the course of a month and probably around 16 to 20 hours worth of dedicated time. Um, yeah, so they certainly can get pretty complex pretty quickly. But then on the other end, there are other items like, let me see if I can find one. Like this guy, you know, this TIE fighter, this took me maybe 45 minutes to build. Yeah, so it's highly variable depending upon what it is you're dealing with and how complex the build is. The Star Destroyer being very interesting just because of the fact that it's also designed that you have that central spine that I talked about earlier, and then having individual plates hanging off of it and suspended from it as the actual outline of the set itself.
So for some of those massive structures that you saw in person, did they give any information on like this took X amount of days to build or whatever?
I don't recall seeing that. I did get some insight on the Tree of Creativity that took something like a couple of weeks in order to build that out, and it took several months prior to that in order to actually design the structure. One of the cool things, if anyone is a complete Lego nerd like I am, you need to get to Billund. It's a fun little town. There's not a whole lot going on there. There's 2 bars, so don't go there for the nightlife. But you can go see things like the Lego Design Studio, where people actually come up with these kits and get an insight in just what it means to develop a Lego set from just selection of pieces into a concrete object and just how long that takes. So as we start looking at something like the dinosaurs or the Tree of Creativity, yeah, construction, couple of weeks of dedicated man or person time or whatever in order to pull that off. But then behind the scenes, we're talking months upon months of design activity in order to figure out just how to construct these sorts of items to come up with the finished product.
Great. And then lastly, what is your take on Lego's axle gate? The fact that someone might not be able to dismantle a piece such as at.
Could you repeat that? I didn't quite understand the first time.
Yeah. Like, what's your take on the fact that some pieces can't be dismantled due to like the way the axle's built? There was a lot of chat in the chat about that. So,
oh, well, I'll probably jump into the chat then and answer that more robustly. It is very interesting with Lego that they are a very product and quality oriented organization. Just from my own professional dealings with them, it's one of the things that drives their business. And so from their perspective, while there's certainly intellectual property facets to that discussion, I know from the standpoint of the people who were there that it's also a question of trying to ensure a consistent and high quality experience for people as they interact with the items, which is why it's been a big deal trying to transition Lego from the existing sort of ABS style plastic that they use to guarantee the long life of the bricks towards something more eco-friendly, but that retains the same tactile and experience and durability as the legacy items. So yeah, from a maker perspective, it kind of stinks not being able to reverse engineer everything, but I think that there's good intentions behind that, at least to a certain extent.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Joe. This was great. If anyone else has any additional questions, Joe will be in the chat.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.